The morning was cloudy and gray, one of when the sky seems to be grieving with you, and the actual clouds seem to be burdened by grief. That is retired, no words may touch Sergeant Major David Cole. A Marine stood still at the base of a shining oak American flag draped over a coffin, holding the dead body of his soul, Marcus James Cole. A brilliant son, 19-year-old first-year college student, whose life had been mercilessly shortened to only 2 weeks prior in a pointless hit-and-run incident. While he made his way home after his night out performing a shift at a community center without for financial gain, but to guide young children in an area where an excessive number of people ended up as hashtags before to their arrival at graduating in full. Marine Corps uniform blues, the same outfit he has previously donned throughout several deployments too. Iraq and Afghanistan, an outfit that carried the burden of more than 20 years of service conflict, and David made the sacrifice and stood tall. Not out of pride, but because it was the only thing holding him upright in that moment when everything else inside him had collapsed. The rows of mourners behind him, a mix of family, neighbors, professors, fellow veterans, and even strangers moved. By Marcus's story sat in stunned silence as taps played softly from a lone trumpet carried on the wind. Like a final prayer, each note piercing through the collective grief like an echo of lost dreams. David had buried friends, men and women he fought, beside warriors who bled for the flag now covering his son's casket, and in those burials, though his heart had hurt, his soul had understood, was the cost of duty, the toll of war. But this was different. This was a wound that logic couldn't explain. A pain that made every breath feel like betrayal because no father, no Marine, no man should ever have to outlive the very legacy he was trying to build. Marcus had been more than his son. He had been David's redemption, his hope, his gentle giant. With a crooked smile, who read James Baldwin by candlelight, played saxophone at open mic nights, and believed that the law wasn't just ink on paper but a tool for justice and healing, especially in communities like the one he came from. And now he lay cold, silent, motionless beneath a flag that both honored him and symbolized a system that hadn't protected him. David stood there, for what felt like hours, saluting with such intensity it seemed he was trying to will his son's spirit back into the world, his hand trembling not from age but from grief that pulsed through every nerve like shrapnel whispered words. No one could hear prayers, only a father could understand. I'm sorry I wasn't there, I should have driven, you should have kept. You safe words that cracked and disappeared into the air as he dropped to one knee, clutching the edge of the casket, not as a Marine, but as a father. Unraveling it was then that his weeping turned into wails, loud and raw, not staged or performative, but the guttural cries of a soul torn from the inside and cawing across the quiet cemetery, bouncing off marble gravestones like shattered glass. The mourners began to cry along with him. Others looked away, uncomfortable in the face of unfiltered pain, but no one moved to stop him because they all knew this wasn't a breakdown. It was a breaking open. However, 2 officers on routine patrol in the nearby residential area, freshly assigned to the precinct and unfamiliar with the community, received a call from a nearby resident reporting a disturbance at the cemetery, a large man yelling and creating a scene. The caller didn't mention a funeral, the dispatcher didn't ask for details, and so within minutes, a squad car rolled slowly up the narrow, paved road leading to the burial site where David was still kneeling, still trembling, still locked in the unbearable moment of final farewell. The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, eyes scanning the crowd, and what they saw was a towering black man in a dark uniform, one they didn't recognize, yelling at a coffin, fists clenched in the air. And while others stood quietly, they fixated on him. They didn't see the medals on his chest. They didn't see the gold stripes on his sleeves. He didn't see the service rings on his hand or the tears streaming down his face. They didn't ask questions, didn't introduce themselves. One called out sharply, "Sir, we need you to calm down and step away." David, lost in mourning, didn't even register. The voice he remained still whispering to the casket when one officer walked closer and repeated the command, this time with force. David slowly turned, blinking in disbelief, as if waking from a dream, and responded with a hoarse voice, "I'm burying my son, please just give me a moment." But the officer, misreading the tension, reached for David's elbow. David instinctively pulled away, not with aggression, but with the muscle memory of a trained soldier, not used to being grabbed unexpectedly. It was that single motion that triggered the other officer, who already had his Hand on his taser, in less than 3 seconds, without warning, a pronged dart shot into David's back and sent 50. 0 volts through his body, making him cease, stumble, and collapse, face first into the dirt right beside the coffin of his only son. The crowd erupted, shouts pierced the silence. Someone screamed, "He's a veteran! What are you doing?" Another cried, "You monsters!" That's his son's funeral cell phones flew out of pockets, recording as chaos unfolded as uniformed officers stood over a fallen Marine dressed in ceremonial blues, shaking from voltage and trauma, while mourners rushed toward him, too afraid to intervene, too horrified to process what had just happened. A little boy clutching a folded flag looked up at his mother and whispered, "Why are they hurting the soldier?" The mother had no answer. The officers called for backup, but what was needed wasn't law enforcement. It was understanding. It was humanity. It was recognition of who David Cole was. It's not just a man in grief, but a man who had given his entire life to serving the very nation that had just turned a taser on him during his darkest hour. And while David lay on the ground, twitching, tears mixing with blood in the soil, the world shifted slightly, because in that moment, justice didn't just bend, it broke, and so did something in everyone who watched. The air had grown heavier in the cemetery, as if nature itself recoiled from what had just unfolded. A decorated black veteran, a grieving father tased in full uniform while mourning his only son beside a fresh grave, and as David Cole lay trembling on the ground, muscles convulsing, face buried in the dirt, inches from the casket draped with the same American flag he once saluted with pride and purpose, a stunned silence gripped the crowd. Like a vice for several long seconds, no one moved, not the officers, who now stood stiff, perhaps realizing too late what they had done, nor the mourners whose sobs turned into gasps of disbelief, nor the mother of Marcus, who fell to her knees screaming her son's name, only to realize that it wasn't her son this time. It was the man who raised him, protected him, who would have taken a bullet for him, now twitching on sacred soil alone, and humiliated the officer who deployed the taser. Began barking protocol into his radio, his voice shaky, trying to control a situation already spiraling beyond his authority. As the second officer knelt beside David and half-heartedly said, "Stay still, sir. You're going to be okay." Words so hollow, they only deepened the wound. David didn't reply. His mind was far from them. His body was in shock, not just from the electric voltage, but from the psychological rupture of being treated not as a grieving parent, not as a Marine, but as a threat, as a man whose pain was criminalized, whose sorrow was mistaken for violence, whose skin, once again, became a sentence. Cameras were rolling. Now the crowd was rising. Someone shouted, "He served this country. Do you even know who he is?" Another added, "You tased a veteran at his own son's funeral?" The volume surged. With every word, a young woman herself, a military wife, pushed through the crowd and gently turned David over, brushing dirt from his face as he tried to focus his eyes. "Sir, we're here. Don't move," she whispered, tears dripping from her chin. The horror of what had just happened spread like wildfire beyond the cemetery gates. When minutes video clips hit Twitter, TikTok, and veteran forums online, the footage, grainy but undeniable, showed David collapsing in real time. Crackle of the taser audible, the uniform unmistakable, the screams undeniable. It was not just another tragedy, it was a national symbol, dishonored in public view, but still within the chaos at the scene. David struggled to his elbows, trying to stand, groaning as his arms failed beneath him. "My son," he murmured, reaching toward the casket. "I just wanted to say goodbye." The woman beside him looked into his eyes and said, "You did and you will again, but you need to stay still." Officers now looked lost, surrounded by a wave of righteous fury they could not silence or explain. One attempted to address the crowd, raising his hands to calm them, but the gesture was empty. "Please understand," he said. "We received a call. We're just trying to what?" Someone shouted back, "Kill him too." And the questions kept coming. Would you have done this if he were white? Did you not see the uniform do? You'd even ask his name? But the officers had no answers, and no one in the crowd was interested in excuses. What they wanted, what they demanded, was accountability, respect, and justice. It was then, at precisely 10:42 a.m. IMA's emergency backup was called, but had not yet arrived that someone in the crowd, a former corporal who had served with David in Helmand Province, pulled out his phone and opened a private chat of Marine veterans called Seer Shield, a group created to respond in times of distress, not with violence but with honor and solidarity. He typed just 6 words. Cole tased, funeral cemetery need backup, and attached the video. No emojis, no hashtags, no panic, just a call to arms. The way Marines answered directly, immediately, and without hesitation, 8 minutes. That was all it took. 8 minutes from humiliation to honor, from shock to storm, from pain to power. Because what those officers didn't understand was that David Cole wasn't alone, not in grief, not in memory, not in battle, and not in this moment. The Marines don't forget their own. They don't leave brothers on the battlefield, and they sure don't let them lie in the dirt. Alone, while wearing dress blues beside the casket of their child as David lay there, heart racing, tears, streaming lungs, struggling shift occurred in the spiritual atmosphere, something unseen but deeply. Felt like the rumble before a thunderstorm, like the moment soldiers sense danger before it strikes because something was coming. A response was rising, and it wouldn't be shouted from a podium or printed in a press release. It would arrive the way real honor does, quietly, quickly, unmistakably, as loyalty in motion dropped to one knee, clutching the edge of the casket, not as a Marine, but as a father unraveling it. Was then that his weeping turned into wails, loud and raw, not staged or performative, but the guttural cries of a soul torn from the inside, echoing across the quiet cemetery, bouncing off marble gravestones. Like shattered glass, some of the mourners began to cry along with him. Others looked away, uncomfortable in the face of unfiltered pain, but no one moved to stop him because they all knew this wasn't a breakdown. It was a breaking open, however, too. Officers on routine patrol in the nearby residential area, freshly assigned to the precinct and unfamiliar with the community, received a call from a nearby resident reporting a disturbance at the cemetery, a large man yelling and creating a scene. The caller didn't mention a funeral. The dispatcher didn't ask for details, and so within minutes a squad car rolled slowly up the narrow paved road leading to the burial site where David was still kneeling, still trembling, still locked in the unbearable. Moment of final farewell. The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, eyes scanning the crowd, and what they saw was a towering black man in a dark uniform, one they didn't recognize, yelling at a coffin, fists clenched in the air, and while others stood quietly, they fixated on him. They didn't see the medals on his chest. They didn't see the gold stripes on his sleeves. They didn't see the service rings on his hand or the tears streaming down his face. They didn't ask questions. They didn't introduce themselves. One called out sharply, "Sir, we need you to calm down and step away." David, lost in mourning, didn't even register the voice. He remained, still whispering to the casket, when one officer walked closer and repeated the command, this time with force. David slowly turned, blinking in disbelief, as if waking from a dream, and responded with a hoarse voice, "I'm burying my son. Please just give me a moment." But the officer, misreading the tension, reached for David's elbow, instinctively pulled away, not with aggression, but with the muscle memory of a trained soldier, not used to being grabbed unexpectedly. It was that single motion that triggered the other officer, who already had his hand on his taser. In less than 3 seconds, without warning, pronged dart shot into David's back and sent 50,000 volts through his body, making him seize, stumble, and collapse face first into the dirt right beside the coffin of his only son. The crowd erupted. Shouts pierced the silence. Someone screamed, "He's a veteran! What are you doing?" Another cried, "You monsters, that's his son's funeral." Cell phones flew out of pockets, recording. As chaos unfolded, as uniformed officers stood over a fallen Marine dressed in ceremonial blues, shaking from voltage and trauma, while mourners rushed toward him, too afraid to intervene, too horrified to process what had just happened. A little boy, clutching a folded flag, looked up at his mother and whispered, "Why are they hurting the soldier?" The mother had no answer. The officers called for backup, but what was needed wasn't law enforcement. It was understanding. It was humanity. It was recognition of who David Cole was, not just a man in grief, but a man who had given his entire life to serving the very nation. that had just turned a taser on him during his darkest hour, and while David lay on the ground twitching tears, mixing. With blood in the soil, the world shifted slightly, because in that moment justice didn't just bend, it broke, and so did something in everyone. Who watched the sound of tires on gravel cut through the thick tension like a blade, oh man, and before anyone could fully process the distant hum of engines. Approaching 3 matte black SUVs pulled up to the cemetery's edge, moving with quiet precision. Not fast enough to draw fear, but with the unmistakable rhythm of men who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were there. The doors opened almost simultaneously, and from them stepped 6 men in full Marine dress blues, each one carrying the invisible weight of battle scars, memories and a code forged not in words but in action. Men who had fought beside David Cole, bled beside him, buried brothers with him, and now stood on sacred ground, not to mourn, but to protect one of their own. They did not walk with arrogance or aggression, but with the solemn force of silent authority. That no badge, no title, no rank outside the corps could imitate. These weren't hired guards or angry protesters. They were Marines, real Marines, men who had been forged in the furnace of war, who had earned every ribbon, every stripe, and every scar. Through loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice, as they walked through the stunned crowd, a hush fell over the cemetery. The noise of outrage and disbelief slowly quieted into a breathless stillness, not from fear, but from awe, because the energy had changed. The atmosphere, once filled with tension and pain, was now infused with something stronger, heavier. Like justice itself had arrived, wearing boots at the center of the crowd, still partially on the ground. David Cole raised his head, eyes squinting. Through pain and confusion, as he saw the men coming toward him, recognition flickered across his bruised face. Like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, one of them Gunnery Sergeant Ramon Blake, a man who had saved David's life during an ambush. Insanin knelt beside him, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "We've got you, Top. You're not alone." Tears filled David's eyes, not from pain but from the relief of knowing that even in his most shattered moment, his brothers had come, not because someone ordered them to, not because it was trending, but because brotherhood doesn't need permission. Another Marine Staff Sergeant Mason stepped forward, standing tall between David and the 2 officers, who now looked more lost than ever, hands twitching at their sides, not sure whether to speak or retreat. Mason didn't yell, he didn't flinch, he simply looked one officer in the eye and said in a voice so low it carried like thunder, "You don't touch a Marine in uniform." Like that, not on a battlefield, not in a church, not at a funeral, never. The crowd now circled in reverent silence, watched as the other Marines helped David to his feet, not hurriedly, but with care, lifting him like he was royalty, brushing the dirt from his medals, straightening his collar, restoring his dignity, piece by piece, with every touch, every glance, every word. A Brotherhood one handed him his cover, placing it gently in his hands as if recounting a king. Another turned to the officers and calmly passed them a folder, clean and precise, containing David's full military record: 22 years of service, 3 combat tours, Bronze Star recipient, Purple Heart leadership citations, and more commendations than either of those officers had seen in a lifetime. The officer holding the file stared at the papers, his face blanching, as the reality settled in. Not only had they tased a grieving father, but they had assaulted a decorated American war hero at his own son's funeral. And now they stood under the unblinking gaze of the very men who had carried the flag through hell and never let it touch the ground. The Marine beside him leaned in and said softly, "You didn't just make a mistake. You disrespected the uniform. We don't let that slide." But again, there was no violence, no revenge, just presence, unshakable presence. A silent protest carved not from rage, but from honor. The cemetery now felt like a courtroom in a cathedral, with 6 Marines serving as both witness and judge, not through weapons, but through their collective gravity around them. The mourners, who had once felt helpless, now stood taller, encouraged by this display of quiet justice. Some began to chant Marcus's name, others began to salute one elderly woman herself. The daughter of a World War II vet wept openly, whispering, "This is what America is supposed to look like." In those few minutes, something extraordinary happened. David Cole, who had fallen not just to the ground but into the abyss of grief and disgrace, was lifted back into his full stature. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and symbolically. As the Marines encircled him, he took a shaky step forward and approached his son's casket. This time not alone, but surrounded, his hand resting on the polished wood, and whispered through cracked lips, "I kept my promise, son. They came for you too." The crowd could hardly contain their emotion. A few Marines began folding the cemetery flag with perfect precision, as if they were closing a chapter of pain and sealing it. With reverence, one of them handed the folded flag to David, who clutched it to his chest like a heartbeat return. Then, without ceremony or instruction, the Marines saluted, slow, strong, unified, and the entire cemetery followed, veterans, civilians, children, and elders, raising hands and hearts toward a moment that transcended politics, race, or rank. What had begun as tragedy had been interrupted by loyalty. What had looked like defeat had been rewritten by unity, and though the taser had left its burn, and the loss of Marcus would never be undone, the message sent that day was clear. Marines don't just fight in war, they show up when it matters most. Not for cameras, not for headlines, but for honor, for family, and for the sacred duty of standing between pain and injustice. As the Marines helped David back toward the funeral procession, the sky, once heavy and gray, began to shift. A single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the scene in light, and someone in the crowd whispered, "Even heaven is saluting today." By the time David Cole was escorted back to the memorial platform, flanked by the 6 Marines who had answered his silent call with sacred loyalty, the world outside the cemetery had already begun to stir with something far bigger than a local incident. News outlets were receiving footage from every angle. Headlines were being written in real time. Hashtags began to trend. Before the burial had even concluded, and what had started as a horrific moment of disrespect toward a grieving black veteran transformed into a nationwide reckoning, while David clutched the folded flag to his chest and stood beside his son's casket for the final prayer. The rest of America was watching, reading, weeping, and reacting to the footage of an American hero collapsing beneath the crackle of a taser, dressed in full military blues beside the grave of the son he couldn't save. And what made it worse, what made it unforgettable, was the complete, unfiltered reality that everyone could see: the heartbreak in his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the medals across his chest, the inhumanity of the act, and the dignity with which the Marines had responded. Within hours, the story had exploded. News anchors interrupted regular programming to show the video. Veterans organizations across the country issued public statements demanding immediate accountability. Social media was consumed with fury and heartbreak. The hashtags #JusticeForDavid, #TED in uniform, sprung, and number 8 minutes later amassed millions of views, and celebrities, political leaders, and civil rights activists posted tributes, denouncements, and calls for reform, while fellow veterans, regardless of race or background, shared stories of mistreatment, a feeling invisible of serving a country that sometimes failed to serve them back when the battle was over. Meanwhile, the 2 officers involved were placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, and the police department issued a vague public statement about an unfortunate miscommunication, but it was too late for damage control. America seen the footage, heard the cries, and more importantly, witnessed the contrast between force and honor, between misunderstanding and brotherhood, between a man broken and the men who carried him. But what mattered most wasn't what the media said it was. What David did 3 days after the burial, after being treated for bruising, psychological trauma, and stress-related hypertension. David appeared before a small crowd, in a sea of cameras, standing behind a podium at the local Veterans Hall, not as a victim, but as a man rising back into his voice. Supported once again by the Marines who stood quietly behind him, arms folded, eyes steady. His speech wasn't long, but every word shook the room. "I wore this uniform to protect my country," said his voice, slow, steady, and filled with quiet power. "I never thought I'd need protection in it, especially not beside the grave of my own child, but I want to make something clear. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to remind America of what this uniform stands for. It doesn't just represent war. It represents sacrifice, family, honor, discipline, and yes, Even grief, no matter how many stripes you see or don't see on a man's sleeve, you never, ever strip him of his humanity. The room erupted in applause, but David raised his hand gently to still it. I didn't rise again by my own strength, he continued. I rose because 6 men remembered who I was when the world forgot they didn't come. With weapons, they didn't come with rage. They came with reverence. That is the difference. That is the legacy my son deserves, as his voice cracked on the last sentence. A moment of holy silence filled the room, the kind of pause where the spirit speaks louder than sound. After the press conference, David received letters from the president, from generals, from mothers and fathers, black and white, rich and poor, all saying the same thing. We saw you, we believe you, we thank you. National movement began to grow. Proposed legislation for veteran protection at public events, mandatory recognition training for local law, enforcement initiatives to create emergency response systems specifically for grieving military families, and a renewed call to honor not just the service of veterans, but their dignity in everyday life. Schools replayed the footage as a case study. Militaries used the moment as a lesson in loyalty and crisis response. The image of the 6 Marines surrounding David as he stood beside his son's grave became iconic, printed on posters, shared across murals, etched into memory as a portrait of what real brotherhood looks like when the cameras are rolling. And when they're not, and in a small but unforgettable act of poetic justice, it's a very cemetery where David was tased. It's established a new code of conduct for all attending officers and created a bronze plaque near Marcus's grave reading, in honor of Sergeant Major David Cole and his son Marcus, made there. Strength remind us what we're supposed to stand for. Every year on the anniversary of Marcus's burial, Marines gather in silence at that spot, not to protest, but to remember, to salute, to carry forward the legacy of a boy full of hope and a father who refused to let pain become bitterness. David, now retired from all public duties, spends most of his days quietly mentoring young men who remind him of Marcus. He teaches them discipline, character, how to tie a tie, how to lift their chin, how to carry grief without letting it become a curse hand. When they ask about that day, he doesn't replay the taser moment, but instead tells them, what matters is who shows up when everything goes silent. He tells them about the 8 minutes, about the arrival, about the storm that never needed lightning to make its impact, because in the end, while the story began with a taser, it didn't end there. Ended with 6 men walking side by side with a broken father, lifting him not just from the dirt, but into the light, turning shame into strength, and making the whole world remember that while injustice can strike in seconds, honor rises with every step, and sometimes it only takes 8 minutes for the Marines to change everything.